It started with the snow, thick, heavy flakes that covered the world in white and made the roads impassable. I should have stayed home, but I didn't. And because of that, I found myself stranded with him, a stranger with kind eyes, a devilish smile, and a way of making me forget the world outside the cabin even existed. The forecast had said flurries, nothing more. A light dusting, they called it, something scenic to set the tone for the winter season. But as I drove deeper into the mountains, the flurries turned into something far more menacing. The snow fell heavier, thick curtains of white blurring the road ahead. My tires crunched against the fresh layer of snow, and my hands gripped the wheel tighter with every mile. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to get off the mountain road and find a hotel. But I'd been stubborn, insistent on finishing my drive to the cabin I'd rented for the weekend. A chance to clear my head, I'd told myself. A brief escape from the deadlines, the noise, and the crushing monotony of my life. But now, I wasn't sure I'd make it. The road was slick, winding in treacherous curves. I could barely see the trees lining the edge of the asphalt, their dark shapes swallowed by the storm. My headlights reflected off the snow, illuminating nothing but an endless white void. The car's tires skidded, and I let out a sharp gasp, my pulse spiking. The vehicle veered slightly, but I managed to steady it, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath. Just as I thought I was in the clear, the car hit a patch of ice. This time, there was no recovery. The tires lost their grip entirely, and the car slid sideways, spinning in a slow, terrifying arc. Everything moved in slow motion, the wheel jerking in my hands, the trees rushing closer, the sound of the tires grinding against the ice. And then, with a sickening crunch, the car slid off the road and into a shallow ditch. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring out into the storm. The engine sputtered before falling silent, leaving me in eerie stillness. I tried to restart the car, but the engine only coughed in protest. My breath came out in short, sharp bursts, fogging up the windshield. I pressed my forehead against the wheel, muttering a string of curses. I was stranded. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal. The screen stared back at me mockingly, the little no-service icon in the corner sealing my fate. For a moment, panic threatened to overtake me. I was alone on a desolate mountain road, with no way to call for help, and no clue how far I was from the nearest town. Then, out of nowhere, a pair of headlights cut through the swirling snow. I froze, squinting into the blinding light as a pickup truck came to a slow stop behind my car. The driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, pulling up the hood of his jacket to shield himself from the storm. I rolled down my window cautiously as he approached, my fingers tightening around the handle of the door just in case. "You all right in there?" the man called, his voice carrying over the howling wind. "I think so," I replied, my voice shaky. "But my car's stuck." He nodded, glancing at the front of my car where it had sunk into the ditch. "Yeah, you're not going anywhere in this storm. Roads are too icy. Do you have a place to stay nearby?" "I was heading to a cabin, but I don't think I'm getting there tonight." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I've got a place not far from here. You can ride out the storm there, better than freezing out here." Under normal circumstances, I would have refused. A stranger offering to take me to a secluded cabin sounded like the start of a bad thriller novel. But I didn't have much of a choice. The temperature was plummeting, and I didn't fancy spending the night in a powerless car while a snowstorm raged outside. "All right," I said, grabbing my bag from the passenger seat. "Thank you." The man helped me out of the car, his hand steady on my arm as I stepped onto the slick, snow-covered ground. I got my first good look at him then. Broad shoulders, strong jawline, piercing green eyes that caught the faint glow of the truck's headlights. "I'm Ryan," he said, his grip firm but not overbearing. "Helen," I replied, my breath visible in the freezing air. The ride to Ryan's cabin was silent, save for the rumble of the truck's engine and the sound of the snow pelting against the windows. I stole a few glances at him as he drove, trying to gauge the kind of man who would stop to help a stranger in the middle of a storm. He looked young, mid-20s maybe, and had the kind of rugged charm you'd expect from someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. His jacket was worn but well kept, and his hands gripped the steering wheel with a kind of quiet confidence. "You're lucky I came down this way," he said eventually, breaking the silence. "Not many people drive this road during a storm like this." "I guess I owe you one," I said, my voice still shaky. He glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just glad I got to you before the storm got worse." The cabin came into view a few minutes later, nestled between tall pine trees that swayed in the wind. It was small but cozy looking, with smoke curling from the chimney and warm light spilling out from the windows. Ryan parked the truck and helped me out, his hand once again steady on my arm as we made our way up the icy steps. "Come on in," he said, holding the door open for me. The cabin was even cozier on the inside. A crackling fire in the stone hearth, a worn leather couch, and shelves lined with books and knickknacks. It smelled faintly of cedar and something warm like cinnamon or vanilla. "Make yourself comfortable," Ryan said, pulling off his jacket and hanging it by the door. "I'll grab some blankets." I nodded, still feeling slightly out of place as I hovered near the fireplace. My clothes were damp from the snow, and I held my hands out toward the flames, letting the heat seep into my skin. Ryan returned a moment later, a stack of blankets in his arms. He set them on the couch, and then disappeared into the small kitchen, returning with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Here," he said, handing one to me. "This'll warm you up." "Thank you," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug. For a while, we just sat there in silence, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the room. Slowly, the tension in my chest began to ease, replaced by a quiet gratitude. "Do you live here alone?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, I work as a wilderness guide, so I'm out in the mountains most of the time. The cabin's just a place to crash between trips." "It's nice," I said, glancing around the room. He smiled, his green eyes crinkling at the corners. "It does the job." The storm outside showed no sign of letting up. As the wind howled and the snow piled higher, I realized I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. For better or worse, I was stranded. With him, the wind didn't stop. It roared against the cabin, shaking the windows and blanketing the world in a thick, impenetrable white. As I sat on Ryan's couch, wrapped in one of the blankets he'd given me, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I wasn't leaving tonight, or maybe even tomorrow. I was completely at the mercy of the storm. Ryan moved around the cabin with the calm efficiency of someone who had weathered storms like this before. He threw another log onto the fire, the flames flaring up in response, their warmth filling the small space. I watched him as he worked, his movements steady and sure. He didn't seem fazed by the weather, or by the fact that he had a stranded stranger sitting in his living room. I, on the other hand, couldn't seem to relax. My clothes were still damp, my muscles tense from hours of driving in the snow. The hot tea Ryan had given me earlier helped, but it did little to quiet the nagging thoughts in my mind. What if the storm lasted for days? What if the power went out completely? What if this man, this stranger, wasn't as kind as he seemed? I shook the thought away. Ryan had done nothing but help me since the moment he found me on the side of the road. Still, being alone with him in such an isolated place made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. The room grew darker as the storm blocked out the last remnants of daylight. The small cabin had only one lantern, and the firelight to fight back the shadows. Ryan returned from the kitchen, carrying a plate with 2 sandwiches. He placed one in front of me without a word, then sat in the armchair across from the couch. I wasn't hungry, but I forced myself to eat. The quiet crunch of bread was the only sound between us for a while, aside from the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it wasn't easy either. I was too aware of everything. Of how quiet it was, of how close we were, of how his eyes flicked to me every so often, like he was trying to figure me out. After dinner, Ryan stood and began tidying up. I watched him stack the empty plates in the sink, his shoulders broad and his movements unhurried. He seemed so at ease here, so at home in the solitude. I envied him. For years, my life had been a blur of deadlines and responsibilities, always rushing from one thing to the next. Even now, I felt the pull of my phone, the emails waiting in my inbox, the to-do list I'd left unfinished. But none of that mattered here. Out in the mountains, in the middle of a snowstorm, there was nothing to do but sit and wait. I should have hated it. But strangely, I didn't. Ryan came back to the living room, sitting on the armrest of his chair. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the quiet confidence in his expression. I studied him for a moment, trying to piece him together. He was younger than me by a good 20 years, but there was something about him that felt older, steadier, more grounded. He caught me staring, and I quickly averted my eyes, my cheeks flushing. The storm raged on as the hours passed, and I found myself growing more comfortable despite myself. The heat from the fire seeped into my bones, the blanket draped around my shoulders a cocoon of warmth. At some point I leaned back against the couch, letting my head rest against the cushion. My body felt heavy, my mind drifting as exhaustion caught up with me. I didn't realize I'd fallen asleep until I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. I opened my eyes to see Ryan standing over me, his expression soft. "You should get some rest," he said quietly. "You'll be more comfortable in the bed." I blinked up at him, my thoughts sluggish. "What about you?" "I'll take the couch," he said simply. The bed was small but warm, the thick quilt smelling faintly of pine. I sank into it gratefully, my body aching from the tension of the day. As I lay there, listening to the muffled roar of the storm outside, my mind wandered back to Ryan. There was something about him that put me on edge, but not in the way I'd expected. He didn't make me feel unsafe. If anything, he made me feel too safe, too seen. It had been years since I'd let anyone close to me. After my husband died, I'd built walls around myself, keeping everyone at arm's length. It was easier that way, easier to keep moving, to keep working, to pretend I didn't need anything or anyone. But tonight, in this cabin, with the storm outside and the firelight flickering against the walls, those walls felt thinner. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the warmth of the bed and the quiet hum of Ryan moving around the cabin stayed with me, wrapping around me like a second blanket. The power went out sometime after midnight. I woke to complete darkness, the only light coming from the faint embers in the fireplace. For a moment, panic gripped me, sharp and suffocating. Then I heard movement in the living room, the sound of Ryan stoking the fire. I pulled the quilt tighter around me, listening to the steady rhythm of his movements. It was strangely comforting, knowing he was there. The cabin grew warmer as the fire flared back to life, its light chasing away the shadows. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts too tangled to sort through. Finally, I got up. Ryan glanced up as I stepped into the living room, his face half lit by the fire. He was sitting on the couch, a blanket draped over his lap, his expression calm but alert. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, sitting down in the armchair. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward this time. It was heavy, meaningful, like the storm outside had pressed pause on the world and left us in a bubble of stillness. I watched the fire, the flames licking at the logs, their heat warming my face. Ryan shifted slightly, his gaze flicking to me. I could feel his attention on me, even when I wasn't looking at him. It made my skin tingle, my breath hitch. Eventually, I looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence stretching between us. I didn't know what I was expecting him to do. Maybe nothing. But there was something in his expression, something quiet and intense, that made my chest tighten. I broke the moment first, glancing away and pretending to adjust the blanket around my shoulders. "You should try to sleep," Ryan said finally, his voice softer now. I nodded, but I didn't move. As the fire crackled and the storm howled, I realized I wasn't scared anymore. Not of the storm, not of being stranded, not of him. And that scared me most of all. The storm continued to rage outside, but by the next morning, the world felt quieter somehow. The snow was piled high against the cabin windows, creating an insulated stillness that made every sound feel magnified. The crackle of the fire, the soft shuffle of Ryan moving around the room, even my own breath. I stayed wrapped in the quilt Ryan had given me, sitting near the fire and watching the snow swirl outside. He'd been up early, making coffee and clearing a path to the porch, though it seemed futile given how quickly the snow filled it back in. He moved with purpose, as if keeping busy was his way of keeping control. I envied that about him. His ease in a situation that would have made anyone else feel helpless. I, on the other hand, felt completely out of place. Being stuck here with no work emails to respond to, no deadlines to meet, and no way to distract myself, left me feeling exposed in a way I hadn't expected. Ryan glanced at me occasionally, his gaze lingering just a second too long before he turned back to whatever he was doing. I wasn't sure if I imagined it, but there was a tension in the air, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. After lunch, Ryan suggested we clear the snow off the porch again. It was still coming down, but more lightly now, and the physical activity would be a welcome distraction. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to venture into the cold, but the cabin was beginning to feel too small. I bundled up in my coat and boots and followed him outside, the freezing air biting at my cheeks. Ryan handed me a snow shovel and showed me how to use it properly, his voice patient and steady as he explained. I couldn't help but smile at his seriousness. It was just snow after all, but I appreciated the distraction. We worked side by side, the silence between us broken only by the scrape of the shovels against the wooden porch. Every now and then, I caught him looking at me, his green eyes bright against the pale gray of the sky. I'd glance away quickly, my heart beating a little faster each time. At one point, I slipped. The snow beneath my boots was slick, and before I could catch myself, I went down hard, landing in a heap on the porch. "Careful." Ryan was at my side in an instant, his strong hands gripping my arms as he helped me to my feet. I tried to laugh it off, but my cheeks burned, both from embarrassment and the way his hands lingered just a little too long on my arms. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I'm fine," I said quickly, brushing the snow off my coat. But as I looked up at him, something shifted. His hands were still on my arms, his gaze locked on mine, and the air between us felt suddenly charged. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to fade away. The storm, the cold, everything except the intensity of his eyes and the warmth of his hands. Back inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly as I sat by the hearth, trying to shake the lingering tension from the moment outside. Ryan had gone to the kitchen to warm up some tea, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't ignore the way my heart had raced when he touched me, the way his eyes had lingered on mine, as if he was searching for something. It had been so long since I'd felt that kind of pull. So long since anyone had looked at me like that. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it, but the thought of Ryan's attention, of his touch, sent a warmth through me that had nothing to do with the fire. That evening, the storm began to ease, though the snow still fell steadily outside. We ate dinner together at the small kitchen table, the conversation light but tinged with something heavier. I was hyper-aware of everything. How close we were sitting, the sound of his breathing, the way his hand brushed mine as he reached for his glass. It was as if the storm outside had created a bubble around us, sealing us off from the rest of the world and leaving us with nothing but each other. Later, as we sat by the fire, Ryan broke the silence. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice low. I didn't respond at first, unsure of how to put my feelings into words. Finally, I said, "It's been a long time since I've been stuck like this, with no distractions." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes it's good to be still." I looked at him then, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. There was something in his expression, something steady and sure, that made my chest tighten. The moment happened so quickly, I barely had time to process it. 1 second, we were sitting in silence, and the next, Ryan had leaned forward, his hand brushing against mine. I looked up, startled, and found his face inches from mine, his green eyes searching mine for a sign, a signal, anything to tell him to stop. But I didn't stop him. When he kissed me, it was soft at first, almost tentative, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, letting the warmth of his lips chase away every doubt, every hesitation. I don't know how long we stayed there, lost in each other. The fire crackled softly in the background, the storm outside now nothing more than a faint whisper. When we finally pulled apart, Ryan rested his forehead against mine, his hand still gently holding my waist. Neither of us spoke, the silence between us filled with 1,000 unspoken thoughts. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension. But words felt too small, too fragile for what had just happened. Instead, I let myself sink into the moment, the warmth of his body and the quiet intensity of his gaze grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, I lay awake in the small bed, my thoughts a tangled mess. I replayed the kiss in my mind, the way his hands had steadied me, the way his eyes had lingered on mine. It had been so long since I'd felt anything like that, since I'd let myself feel anything at all. Part of me wanted to run, to build my walls back up and pretend that moment by the fire hadn't happened, but another part of me, a part I thought I'd buried long ago, wanted more. The storm outside had quieted, but inside I felt like a whirlwind, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. The next morning, the cabin was cloaked in stillness. The snow outside had slowed to a gentle drift, flakes floating lazily to the ground, but the storm had left its mark. Banks of white piled high against the windows and blanketed the surrounding trees, muting the world into a soft, pale glow. I lingered in bed longer than usual, reluctant to face whatever the day might bring. My mind was a storm of its own, replaying the kiss from the night before. The way Ryan's touch had set something alight in me I hadn't felt in years. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. The rational part of me knew I should keep my distance, that whatever was happening between us couldn't lead anywhere good. But another part of me, the part that had spent so many years feeling invisible, unworthy of attention, didn't want to stop. By the time I emerged from the bedroom, Ryan was already up, a mug of coffee in his hand as he stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered forest. He didn't say anything as I entered the room, and neither did I. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down on the couch, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken things. I avoided his gaze, unsure of what I'd find there. Regret, confusion, or something else entirely. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching out into an eternity. We spent most of it in the quiet rhythm of routine, clearing snow from the porch, bringing in more firewood, and trying to keep the cabin warm as the temperature outside continued to drop. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. He was so close, yet so untouchable, moving through the small space with an ease that made me feel unmoored. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand, sent a jolt through me, a reminder of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. I caught him looking at me more than once, his gaze lingering in a way that made my pulse quicken. But he didn't say anything, and neither did I. It wasn't until the late afternoon that the silence finally broke. I was sitting by the fire, flipping through one of the books from Ryan's shelf, when he came to sit across from me. The weight of his presence was impossible to ignore, and I felt my heart rate pick up as he settled into the chair. I tried to focus on the pages in front of me, but I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unwavering. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time all day. The intensity of his stare took my breath away. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just quiet certainty, like he'd already made up his mind. I don't know who moved first. One second, we were sitting across from each other, the fire crackling softly between us, and the next, he was there, pulling me into him with a gentle but insistent grip. His lips found mine, and the world around us seemed to disappear. There was no snowstorm, no cabin, no outside world, just the heat of his body and the way he made me feel like I was the only person that mattered. I let myself get lost in him, my hands tangling in his hair as his arms wrapped around me. There was no hesitation this time, no holding back. For the first time in years, I let myself want. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of warmth and closeness, a stark contrast to the cold storm still visible through the cabin windows. Ryan was attentive, his touch soft yet sure, his movements deliberate. He wasn't rushed or impatient, he took his time, as if he wanted to savor every moment. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed this, being touched, being wanted. My body responded to him in ways I'd forgotten it could, every nerve alive and humming under his hands. It wasn't just physical, though. There was an emotional weight to it, a depth that caught me off guard. He looked at me like I was something precious, something worth cherishing, and it made my heart ache in the best way. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the firelight casting soft shadows across the room. Ryan's hand traced lazy patterns on my arm, his touch light but grounding, as if he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing even as my body relaxed against him. I wanted to stay in this moment forever, to let myself believe that the world out didn't exist. But I knew better. "What happens when the storm ends?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he tightened his grip on me, his breath warm against my neck. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice steady. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to the steady rhythm of Ryan's breathing and watching the shadows dance across the walls. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Exhilaration, fear, hope, and doubt, all tangled together in a way that left me feeling raw and exposed. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't planned for him. But now that he was here, I couldn't imagine going back to the way things were. And that terrified me. The next morning, the snow had stopped entirely. The world outside was bright and still, the sun reflecting off the fresh blanket of snow and casting everything in a blinding white glow. It was beautiful, serene, but it felt like a countdown had started, each ray of sunlight bringing us closer to the moment we'd have to leave this little bubble we'd created. Ryan was already up when I emerged from the bedroom, the smell of coffee filling the air. He looked up as I entered the room, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," I replied, my chest tightening at the sight of him. We spent the day preparing to dig out the truck and clear a path to the main road. The work was hard but satisfying, and for a while I let myself focus on the physical effort, the rhythmic scrape of the shovels against the snow. But as the day wore on, the reality of our situation began to creep back in. The storm had passed, and the world outside was waiting for us. That evening, as we sat by the fire one last time, the weight of what lay ahead hung heavy between us. Neither of us said much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things we couldn't bring ourselves to say. The hope, the fear, the uncertainty. I didn't know what would happen when we left the cabin. But for now, I let myself rest in the warmth of Ryan's presence, holding on to the quiet certainty of the moment for as long as I could. The world outside the cabin had transformed. The storm's rage had given way to calm, and the snow blanketing the mountains seemed almost untouched, pristine in the golden morning sunlight. But as beautiful as it was, it also meant our time in the cabin had come to an end. I stood by the window, watching Ryan dig out the truck from beneath layers of heavy snow. The sound of the shovel scraping against the driveway drifted through the frosted glass. Each stroke of his shovel felt like a countdown, a reminder that this perfect, impossible bubble we'd shared was about to burst. Behind me, the fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth doing little to ease the chill creeping into my chest. By mid-morning, the truck was free, its engine rumbling in the crisp mountain air. Ryan returned to the cabin, his cheeks flushed from the cold, a faint smile on his face as he brushed the snow from his jacket. "Roads look passable," he said simply. I nodded, my heart sinking. I'd known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, it felt too soon. Packing up didn't take long. My bag, which had seemed so heavy when I first arrived, felt impossibly light now. Each step I took around the cabin felt final, like I was erasing the traces of myself I'd left here. Ryan moved with quiet efficiency, checking the fire and locking up the windows, but there was a tension in his movements, a heaviness that mirrored my own. When everything was ready, we stood in the cabin's doorway, looking out at the snow-covered forest. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, Ryan turned to me, his green eyes steady. "You ready?" I wasn't. The drive down the mountain was uneventful, but it felt like something had shifted. The quiet between us wasn't the same as it had been in the cabin. It was tighter, more fragile, as if we were both afraid to break it. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment we'd shared over the past few days. The way his hands had felt on my skin, the warmth of his breath against my neck, the softness in his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking. It felt surreal now, like a dream I'd woken up from too soon. When we reached the edge of town, Ryan pulled into a gas station and parked the truck. "This is probably where we should part ways," he said quietly, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The words hit me like a punch to the chest, even though I'd known they were coming. I looked at him, searching for something, anything, to say, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. Instead, I nodded, forcing a small smile. Thank you, for everything. Ryan's gaze lingered on me, his green eyes soft but filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Or longing. For a moment I thought he might say something that would change everything. But he didn't. The drive back to my house was a blur. The streets were busy, cars rushing past me as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. When I pulled into my driveway, the house felt unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. I stepped inside, dropping my bag by the door and standing in the entryway, unsure of what to do next. The silence was deafening. The days that followed were hard. I threw myself into work, filling my time with emails, meetings, and deadlines, but nothing felt right. My mind kept drifting back to Ryan, to the warmth of his cabin, the quiet strength of his presence, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only person who mattered. I tried to tell myself it was just the circumstances. We'd been thrown together by the storm, two strangers finding comfort in each other during an extraordinary situation. It didn't mean anything, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A week after leaving the cabin, I found myself drafting an email to Ryan. I didn't know what I wanted to say, but the words poured out anyway. I told him about how much I missed the mountains, how the city felt suffocating now, how I couldn't stop thinking about him. But before I could send it, I hesitated. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if I was just a fleeting moment for him, a temporary distraction during the storm? I stared at the screen for what felt like hours before finally hitting delete. Life went on, but it felt colorless, like the snowstorm had taken all the vibrancy with it. I went through the motions, work, errands, the occasional dinner with friends, but everything felt muted, dull. I tried to push Ryan out of my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard the low timbre of his voice, felt the warmth of his hands on mine. Then, one evening, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I thought I might have imagined it. But the knock came again, louder this time. When I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Ryan stood on my porch, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, snowflakes clinging to his dark hair. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. He stepped inside, the cold following him as he closed the door behind him. I felt frozen, unsure of what to say or do. "I didn't know if I should come," he admitted, his gaze searching mine. "But I couldn't let things end like that, not without telling you how I feel." My chest tightened, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I don't know if this can work," I said, my voice trembling. "We're from two completely different worlds." "I don't care about that," Ryan said, stepping closer. "What we had in that cabin wasn't just a moment, Helen. It was real, and I think you feel that too." His words broke something inside me. The walls I'd spent years building around myself, crumbling in an instant. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we could make this work, or if it would all come crashing down in the end. But as I looked into Ryan's eyes, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't ready to let him go. Ryan's words hung in the air, the silence between us heavy and charged. He stood in my entryway, wet snow still clinging to his boots, his breath visible in the cold that had followed him inside. I hadn't moved, hadn't said a word since he'd told me he couldn't stop thinking about me. My heart was racing, every beat a reminder of how close I was to making a decision that could change everything. I wanted to speak, to tell him I'd felt the same, that I hadn't been able to go a single day without thinking about him either. But the words wouldn't come. Ryan didn't push me. He just stood there, his green eyes steady, his expression calm but expectant. "I don't want to overwhelm you," he said finally, his voice low. "But I had to see you, Helen. I couldn't leave things the way they were." There was something about the way he said my name, the way his voice softened like it was meant for me alone, that undid me completely. I stepped back, gesturing for him to come in out of the cold. He hesitated for a moment, then followed, closing the door behind him. The house suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, with him here. Ryan slipped off his coat and boots, setting them neatly by the door, then stood there, waiting. I didn't know what to do with myself. Part of me wanted to rush to him, to wrap my arms around him and never let go. But another part of me, the cautious, guarded part that had spent years building walls, was still screaming at me to slow down. "Do you want coffee?" I asked finally, my voice breaking the silence. Ryan smiled faintly, nodding. "Sure." I moved to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I pulled out the coffee pot and started brewing. The familiar rhythm of the task grounded me, but I could feel Ryan's presence behind me, steady and unyielding. As the coffee brewed, I turned to face him, leaning back against the counter. He stood near the table, his hands in his pockets, his gaze never leaving me. "You didn't have to come here," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "I know," he replied. We sat at the table, the steaming mugs between us, the quiet hum of the heater filling the space. I hadn't realized how cold I was until I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting its warmth seep into my skin. Ryan didn't say much, and neither did I. But his presence was enough, steady and comforting, like the storm that had brought us together had left behind a calm I hadn't expected. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house filled with soft evening light, I found myself sitting with Ryan on the couch. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was something else entirely. A quiet understanding that neither of us wanted to break. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. It was too big, too complicated, a tangled mess of fear and hope, and something that felt dangerously close to joy. As the evening wore on, Ryan turned to me, his expression soft. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said. "And I don't expect you to have all the answers right now, but I want you to know that I'm here, for however long it takes." His words broke something inside me, the last fragile barrier I'd been clinging to. I didn't respond with words. Instead, I leaned into him, resting my head against his chest. His arms came around me, holding me close, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself exhale. The days that followed felt like a dream. Ryan stayed, and for a little while, we let ourselves exist in a bubble of quiet intimacy. We went for long walks in the park, talked late into the night, and shared quiet meals at the kitchen table. It wasn't perfect. I still struggled with doubts, with fears about what people would think, about whether this could really work. But Ryan never wavered. He was patient, steady, always there to remind me that I didn't have to face it alone. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ryan reached for my hand. "You don't have to decide everything now," he said, "but I need to know if this is something you want, something we can build together." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink. "I don't know what the future holds," I said finally, "but I know that I don't want to lose you." From that moment on, we stopped holding back. Ryan didn't go back to the mountains right away. Instead, he stayed, helping me adjust to this new chapter of my life. We faced the challenges together. The whispered comments, the disapproving glances, the endless questions about our age difference. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wondered if we'd made a mistake, if the storm that had brought us together had left us chasing something that wasn't meant to last. But then, there were moments like this. Sitting on the porch with Ryan's hand in mine, watching the world settle into dusk, that made it all worth it. Months later, we returned to the cabin where it had all started. The snow had melted, replaced by a vibrant green that stretched across the mountains. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the cabin felt like a completely different place. We spent the weekend hiking the trails, sitting by the fire, and revisiting the memories that had brought us here. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Ryan turned to me, his expression soft but serious. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he said. I smiled, resting my head against his shoulder. "I didn't think I'd let someone like you in." As the fire crackled softly and the night settled in around us, I realized something. The storm that had stranded us together had done more than change my plans. It had changed my life. For the first time in years, I felt alive, connected, and ready to take the leap into whatever the future held. With Ryan by my side, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. He walked into the room and I froze mid-stretch. My arms were above my head, my back arched slightly, the hem of my tank top riding up just enough to reveal the soft curve of my waist. I wasn't expecting him, and by the look on his face, he wasn't expecting me either. For a long moment, neither of us moved. His silence was deafening, the weight of his gaze lingering on me before he quickly looked away. "Sorry," he muttered, clearing his throat. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's fine," I said quickly, too quickly, as I dropped my arms and adjusted my shirt. My face felt warm, but I couldn't tell if it was embarrassment or something else entirely. Ryan turned, mumbling something about needing to check the gutters, and disappeared down the hall before I could say another word. But his silence stayed with me. I hadn't expected him to be here today. My stepson's visits were sporadic, kind gestures wrapped in practicality. After the divorce, I assumed I'd never see him again, but Ryan surprised me by showing up one afternoon with a toolbox in hand, offering to help with repairs around the house. "It's the least I can do," he'd said. That was 6 months ago. At first I thought he came out of obligation, a sense of duty left over from his childhood. I'd married his father, Simon, when Ryan was just 16, and though our relationship was never especially close, it was never strained either. Polite, cordial, mutually respectful in the way two people circling each other's orbits tend to be. But Simon and I had fallen apart. His betrayal wasn't explosive, just insidious. A gradual pulling away, a series of missed glances and ignored moments, culminating in his departure with a younger, brighter woman. It wasn't the age difference that stung so much as the fact that I hadn't seen it coming. Or maybe I had, and I just didn't want to admit it. In the aftermath, I threw myself into routines. Mornings with black coffee and a sunrise I hardly noticed. Afternoons spent rearranging furniture I didn't even like. And evenings with yoga mats spread across the sunroom floor, trying to stretch away the tightness in my chest. Ryan's visits disrupted the monotony in ways I hadn't expected. He fixed the wobbly porch railing, patched the hole in the drywall, and replaced the burnt-out bulbs in the hallway. But it wasn't just his work that lingered, it was his presence. That morning, after he walked out of the sunroom, I tried to focus on my stretches, but the rhythm was gone. My mind kept replaying the way he'd looked at me, not inappropriately, but not indifferently either. There was something about Ryan I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was the way his shoulders had broadened since I'd first met him, or the confidence he carried now at 25. He wasn't a teenager anymore. He was a man. I shook my head, forcing the thought away. This was ridiculous. Ryan was just being kind, helping me out because his father wouldn't. There was nothing more to it. Still, later that afternoon, as I folded laundry and watched the rain patter against the windows, I found myself glancing toward the front door, wondering if he'd be back soon. I told myself it was because the gutters really did need fixing. The rain had stopped by the time Ryan came back inside. He'd been on the ladder for nearly an hour, clearing leaves from the gutters and brushing dirt from the shingles, his sweatshirt damp and clinging to his arms. I glanced up from the kitchen counter where I was chopping vegetables for dinner, trying to keep my voice casual. "Get everything sorted out up there?" He nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Yeah, though you might want to think about trimming that tree out back. The branches are what's clogging everything up." I smiled faintly. "I'll add it to the list." Ryan raised an eyebrow, leaning against the doorway. "This infamous list of yours is getting out of hand. When's the last time you just let something be?" I paused, the knife hovering over the cutting board. It was such a simple question, but it hit harder than I expected. Letting things be wasn't my strong suit. "Probably never," I admitted, forcing a laugh. Ryan tilted his head, studying me for a moment. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know?" I shrugged, trying to downplay the weight of his words. "Old habits die hard, I guess." He didn't reply, but there was something in his gaze. Something steady, almost searching, that made my pulse quicken. I broke the moment by returning to my task, focusing on the rhythmic chop of the knife against the wooden board. Ryan stayed for dinner, as he often did these days. It wasn't planned. He'd just linger until the sun dipped low and I'd insist he join me. Cooking for one had always felt lonely, but cooking for two made the house feel just a little warmer. That night, we ate at the small table in the kitchen. The dining room had always felt too formal, too full of ghosts. "This is good," Ryan said, nodding toward his plate. Just pasta, I replied, though I couldn't help but feel pleased by the compliment. It's better than I'd make, he said, grinning. Pretty sure my idea of cooking is dumping hot sauce on whatever's in the fridge. I laughed, a genuine sound that felt foreign in my own ears. Well, you're welcome to dinner anytime, as long as you promise not to ruin it with hot sauce. Deal, he said, his grin softening into a smile that lingered just a second too long. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged. I could feel his eyes on me as I sipped my wine, and when I finally looked up, the intensity of his gaze made my breath hitch. What? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He shook his head, his smile fading. Nothing. Just, it's nice to see you like this. Like what? Relaxed, he said simply. I wanted to tell him I wasn't relaxed, that I was anything but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I forced a small smile and reached for my glass again. The next day, Ryan showed up with a toolbox and an air of determination. What's all this? I asked, watching as he hauled the heavy case into the living room. Your infamous list, he replied, pulling out a wrench. Figured I'd make a dent in it. I couldn't help but laugh, shaking my head. You don't have to do that. I want to, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. For the next few hours, I watched as he moved through the house with a kind of quiet efficiency. He tightened loose cabinet handles, fixed a leaky faucet, and even replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors. At one point, he asked me to hold a flashlight while he worked on the ceiling fan in the guest room. Standing beneath him, I couldn't help but notice the way his shirt stretched across his back, the muscles in his arms flexing as he adjusted the screws. You've gotten good at this, I said, my voice coming out softer than I intended. Ryan glanced down at me, his smile lopsided. What, fixing things? Taking care of people, I said before I could stop myself. For a moment, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged, returning to his work. I learned from the best. The comment caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I busied myself by adjusting the flashlight, but the words stayed with me long after he'd finished. A week later, Ryan invited me out to dinner. You've been cooped up too long, he said when I hesitated. Come on, it'll be good for you, my treat. I wanted to say no, to come up with some excuse to stay home where it was safe. But the way he looked at me, earnest, hopeful, made it impossible to refuse. The restaurant he chose was small and cozy, tucked away on a quiet street I hadn't been to in years. The kind of place Simon would have dismissed as too quaint. This is nice, I said as we sat down, the soft glow of the candlelight casting shadows across the table. I thought you'd like it, Ryan replied, his smile easy. Over the course of the meal, the conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about everything and nothing, his work, my hobbies, the latest book I'd read. But as the wine flowed and the plates were cleared, the topics grew heavier. I've been meaning to ask, Ryan said, his voice quieter now. How are you holding up? Really? I hesitated, the question cutting through the easy atmosphere we'd built. I'm fine, I said reflexively. Ryan frowned. You don't have to say that, not to me. His sincerity was disarming, and I felt my defenses crumbling. It's hard, I admitted. Some days are better than others, but mostly I just feel stuck. Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. You don't have to stay stuck, you know. You deserve more than that. His words lingered, heavy and unresolved, as we left the restaurant and drove home in near silence. When he walked me to the door, there was a moment, just a moment, where he hesitated, his gaze lingering on mine. I thought for a second that he might say something, but he didn't. And as I stepped inside, my heart was pounding so loudly that I barely noticed the way my hands trembled as I locked the door behind me. The rain started mid-morning, a soft drizzle that quickly grew into a steady downpour. I was in the living room, tugging at the edge of the couch in a futile attempt to shift it closer to the wall. It had been bothering me for weeks, a slight angle that made the whole room feel off balance. Need some help? Ryan's voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair damp from the rain. He held a toolbox in one hand and a reusable shopping bag in the other. I didn't realize you were coming over, I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. He shrugged, setting the bag down on the counter. Figured I'd check on you. Picked up a few things on the way. Milk, eggs, the usual. I smiled faintly. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, Before I could argue, he stepped into the room, his gaze falling on the couch. "This giving you trouble?" "It's nothing," I said quickly. "I was just trying to move it a little." Ryan raised an eyebrow, a teasing grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "By yourself? You know I'm right here, right?" "I didn't want to bother you," I muttered, feeling a flush creep up my neck. "You never bother me," he said, his tone softening. The words hung in the air for a moment before he moved past me, crouching beside the couch to examine its base. "All right," he said, straightening up. "On 3? I hesitated but nodded, moving to the opposite side. 1, 2, 3. Together, we lifted, the couch shifting easily under our combined strength. But as we set it down, Ryan's hand brushed against mine, the contact sending a spark of something sharp and electric through me. I pulled back quickly, my pulse racing. "Thanks," I said, my voice a little too bright. Ryan studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing. "You okay?" "Fine," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Just tired, I guess." He didn't press the issue, but I could feel his eyes on me as I moved to the kitchen, pretending to busy myself with the groceries he'd brought. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, unspoken tension. Ryan helped me rearrange the living room, offering his usual mix of practical advice and teasing commentary. But there was something different about the way he looked at me. Something I couldn't quite name. By the time the rain eased into a light drizzle, my nerves were frayed, and I was grateful when he finally announced he was heading home. But as I watched him leave, his shoulders hunched slightly against the rain, I felt a pang of something that wasn't quite relief. That evening, I found him sitting on the porch when I went to lock up for the night. He was leaning against the railing, a half-empty bottle of beer in his hand, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. "Did you forget something?" I asked, stepping outside. He shook his head. "Just didn't feel like going home yet." His voice was quiet, almost somber, and I hesitated before sitting down on the bench beside him. The air was cool and damp, the smell of rain lingering in the breeze. "You okay?" I asked after a moment. Ryan glanced at me, a small, wry smile tugging at his lips. "I should be asking you that." I frowned. "Why?" "Because you've been tense all day," he said simply. "Did I do something to upset you?" "No," I said quickly, too quickly. "Of course not." He tilted his head, his gaze steady and searching. "Then what is it?" I hesitated, my hands twisting in my lap. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I guess I'm not used to having someone around. It's been a long time since." I trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Ryan didn't press me. Instead, he took a long sip of his beer, his gaze drifting toward the yard. "You know," he said after a moment, "I used to think my dad had it all figured out. The house, the job, you." I glanced at him, startled by the rawness in his tone. "But he didn't," Ryan continued, his voice quiet but firm. "He didn't appreciate what he had, and I hated him for that. I hated the way he treated you, like you were just another piece of furniture in his perfect little life." His words took the breath from my lungs. I turned to him, my throat tightening. "Ryan, I'm not saying this to upset you," he said quickly. I've always admired you, Lillian. The way you handled everything, the way you held yourself together, even when he didn't deserve it." I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. "That's kind of you to say," I whispered. "It's not kindness," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "It's the truth." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional drip of water from the porch roof. Then Ryan reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a wave of warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. "Lillian," he began, his voice soft. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I care about you. More than I probably should." My heart thundered in my chest, and I struggled to find my voice. "Ryan, this is—" "I know," he said, cutting me off gently. "I know it's complicated, but I need you to know how I feel. I need you to know that you're not alone in this." His words were both a comfort and a burden, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I could stop it. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," Ryan said, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "I just needed to tell you." We sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of his confession settling over us like a blanket. I knew I should pull away, draw a line before it was too late. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed, my hand still resting in his, the warmth of his touch chasing away the cold emptiness I'd carried for so long. The storm rolled in late the next evening. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, growing louder as the night stretched on. By the time the power flickered out, the house was bathed in near-total darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the windows. I was lighting candles in the living room when I heard the knock at the door. My heart leapt unexpectedly, though I already knew who it was. Ryan stood on the porch, rain dripping from the edge of his hood and pooling at his feet. "Power's out at my place," he said with a small shrug. "Thought I'd check on you." I stepped aside to let him in, his presence immediately filling the quiet, cavernous space. "You didn't have to come all the way over here," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Ryan pulled back his hood, shaking rain from his hair. "I didn't want you to be alone." His words sent a warmth through me that I tried to ignore. "Well, you're here now," I said, turning toward the kitchen. "Let me grab you a towel." When I came back, he was in the living room, crouched by the fireplace. The soft glow of the candles caught on the planes of his face as he worked to coax a flame to life. "Power outage or not, this house gets cold at night," he said, glancing over his shoulder at me. I nodded, handing him the towel. "Thank you." He stood, drying his hair and shoulders before tossing the towel onto the back of a chair. "There," he said as the fire crackled to life. "That's better." The room grew warmer, both from the fire and his presence. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the silence between us broken only by the occasional pop of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. "You've been quiet today," Ryan said after a while, his voice soft. I glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated, my fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket draped over my lap. "About us," I admitted finally. Ryan didn't look away. "What about us?" "That this," I gestured vaguely, "between us, might be a mistake." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you really believe that?" I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came. Because the truth was, I didn't know. Ryan reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "Lillian, I know this isn't simple, but nothing about the way I feel for you feels wrong. If anything, it's the most honest thing I've ever felt." His words cracked something open inside me. A dam I'd been holding back for far too long. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them away, my voice trembling as I spoke. "I'm scared," I admitted. "So am I," he said, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "But we don't have to figure it all out tonight. We just have to be honest with each other." The firelight danced in his eyes, and I felt the pull between us growing stronger, impossible to ignore. "Ryan," I whispered, but before I could say anything more, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, the kiss deepening as the tension that had been building between us finally broke. I wasn't sure how we ended up in my bedroom. One moment we were on the couch, and the next we were climbing the stairs, his hand warm and steady on the small of my back. The rain outside had picked up again, the steady rhythm of it against the windows blending with the sound of my heartbeat. Ryan hesitated at the doorway, his gaze searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. "Yes," I whispered, the word leaving my lips before I could second-guess it. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of the candles we'd brought upstairs. The shadows danced across the walls as Ryan closed the door behind him, his steps careful as he crossed the room to stand in front of me. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between us. Then he reached for me, his hands settling on my waist as he pulled me closer. His kiss was slow, deliberate, as though he was memorizing every moment. His hands moved to cradle my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks, and I felt myself melting into him. He was patient, attentive, his movements guided by care rather than urgency. He traced the curve of my shoulders, the line of my spine, his touch sending shivers through me that had nothing to do with the cool air in the room. When we finally came together, it was like the world outside ceased to exist. The rain, the storm, the uncertainty, they all faded into the background, leaving only the two of us. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something I hadn't felt in years. As the night stretched on, I felt myself let go of the doubts and fears that had kept me locked away for so long. With Ryan, I didn't feel like someone who had been left behind. I felt seen, wanted, and alive. When it was over, we lay tangled together in the soft glow of the candles, the sound of the rain now a soothing rhythm. Ryan's arm was draped over my waist, his breath warm against my shoulder. "I don't regret this," he murmured, his voice soft but firm. I turned to look at him, my fingers brushing against his jaw. "Neither do I." And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But it doesn't have to be complicated either. We don't have to figure everything out right now. We can take it one step at a time." His words were gentle, reassuring, but they didn't erase the uncertainty twisting in my chest. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. "That's up to you," he said simply. I looked down at our hands, the warmth of his touch grounding me. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But for the first time in years, I felt like I didn't have to have it all figured out. As we stood there, the sunlight painting the room in soft gold, I allowed myself a small, tentative smile. The day stretched ahead of us, uncertain and full of possibility. And for now, that was enough. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the bedroom. I woke before Ryan, the sound of his steady breathing filling the quiet space. His arm was still draped over my waist, his hand resting lightly on my hip. For a moment, I lay there, unmoving, my mind racing as I stared at the ceiling. The events of the night before felt surreal, like a dream I wasn't ready to wake from. But the warmth of his body beside mine, the way his fingers twitched slightly in his sleep, it was real. I'd crossed a line I never thought I would. The guilt was there, hovering at the edges of my mind, whispering all the reasons why this shouldn't have happened. But beneath the guilt was something else, something stronger. A quiet, insistent joy. For so long, I'd felt invisible, like a shadow moving through a house filled with echoes. Last night, Ryan had reminded me what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted. And as much as I tried to tell myself it was wrong, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Carefully, I slipped out from under his arm, wrapping my robe around me as I crossed to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the yard glistening in the morning light. The world outside looked the same, but everything inside me felt different. Behind me, I heard the rustle of sheets, followed by the soft sound of Ryan's voice. "Good morning." I turned to see him sitting up, his hair tousled, a sleepy smile tugging at his lips. "Good morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. I hesitated before nodding. "I think so." We moved to the kitchen, where the sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden pools of light across the floor. I brewed a pot of coffee while Ryan leaned against the counter, watching me in that quiet, steady way of his. The silence between us wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken questions. Finally, Ryan broke it. "Lillian, I meant what I said last night. I don't regret this, not any of it." I turned to face him, my hands wrapped around my coffee mug. "It's not that simple, Ryan," I said softly. "You know that.